Hello and good morning. I am Nicholas Pratt, Technology and Operations Editor at Funds Europe and author of the report we produced with Cassis entitled Governance and the Climate Risk Dilemma. Today's discussion will focus on some of the key findings from the report, so before we get to the debate, I would like to give you a brief summary of some of these findings. This is the fifth research report we have produced with Cassis. Last year, our survey looked at product distribution and governance trends, and from that, it was clear that ESG was an area of increasing interest to investors. So with this year's report, we wanted to look at this area in more detail and specifically at climate risk. A total of 248 funds professionals participated in the survey, which focused on three areas: fund governance, education and upskilling, and data. So firstly, fund governance. What should fund boards be doing, and what are they actually doing about identifying climate risk? Encouragingly, 83% of respondents recognise that asset managers face greater reputational risk if their climate commitments are not adhered to. And I think it's fair to say that recent events have underlined the importance of this adherence. In late May, the SEC issued BNY Mellon with a six-figure fine for misstatements and omissions about its ESG considerations between 2018 and 2021. And then in Frankfurt, the offices of DWS were raided by the police as part of a greenwashing investigation, which has led to the resignation of its chief executive. However, climate is more than a reputational risk or a regulatory requirement. It is an investment risk in itself. So it is less reassuring that only 36% of respondents said that their asset management boards are overseeing the integration of climate factors into business and risk management processes, and only 19% have a reporting process in place to provide full disclosure on forward-looking investment risk. When it comes to education and upskilling, our survey found that the industry could be facing a potential skill shortage, as cited by 72% of respondents. More than a fifth of respondents, 21%, have prioritised the development of an educational framework to upskill key employees across all functional areas. However, more than a quarter, 26%, do not currently offer any formal training around climate. And given the potential skills shortage, we would expect this number to increase in the future. Lastly, data. So many of the challenges around climate involve data. For example, when asked if they have sufficient data to examine climate risk exposures across their funds, only a third, 31%, have relevant data across all of their funds. A similar number, 32%, have sufficient information flow, but only for climate-specific funds. The largest number, though, 37%, simply do not have sufficient information for all of their funds. This suggests a data availability problem. However, many will contend that there is an abundance of data out there, so why is there a disconnect? The problem appears to be obtaining the data and the consistency of the data, with different data providers using different formats. However, this should not be a barrier to action. This data is important for transparency and building trust with investors, and this data is needed at a security and portfolio level to manage investment risk generated by climate factors. And there are various initiatives out there to produce more standardization, such as the International Sustainability Standards Board. So, in conclusion, it's clear that we are only at the beginning of what will be a very difficult but important journey. So now I'd like to hand over to Pat Sharman, UK Country Managing Director at Cassis, who will be moderating the panel and will introduce our panellists. But just some brief housekeeping. Please send in questions through the BrightTalk platform. We like our sessions to be as interactive as possible, and we will also make a digital copy of the report available through the platform. So, over to you, Pat.
Thank you, Nick, and good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. We have an excellent panel with us today, who I'll introduce in a moment. The panel are here to discuss the current governance challenges within fund boards and within asset management. And we're specifically going to focus on climate risk today, but we will cover governance in broader terms. So introducing our panel, I'll go from the furthest to the left. So David Neal, who's currently Head of UK Equities at Mirabeau Asset Management. David also has a background in climatology. And then in the middle, we have Julia Kirkland, and Julia is Head of Regulatory Training at CSHI. And then right to my left here, we have the second David Hunter. So I will refer to David Hunter as David H in this panel, not just to confuse everybody. And David is the CIO and the co-founder of Renuity. So what we're going to do is we're going to kick off with a discussion around governance. And, Nick actually pointed out, within our survey today, that 83 of our respondents said that they actually recognise that if fund boards don't manage climate risk, this could be a reputational risk to them. So Julia, can I start off with you and just giving us your view of what you think good governance looks like on a fund board?
Certainly. Good governance. For me, it's 5 key elements, and these are pulled from the regulator. You have to search for them, but they do give you a pathway. They do give you these pointers, and there are five elements, as I say, to good governance. The first thing is the right structure. You've got to have the right structure and functioning governing body. If we take into account the asset management market study, that gave us the instruction that we needed to include and use our access to INEDs. So we now have a compulsory quota for INEDs on fund boards. Those need to be there, but of course you need to get the right people, and we'll come back to that as part of these elements. The second element for me is the right values and culture. These need to be clearly articulated, and of course now thinking about our discussion piece today, need to amplify where you are on this whole discussion around the climate agenda. The third piece is effective individuals. Now that picks back up on the point about those members, the structure and those members of the governing body, but effective individuals. So they need to be competent, they need to be capable, and they need to have been assessed. All of which I would suggest you need to be evidencing as well. The fourth element is risk management. So your risk management framework obviously going to be critical. We'll probably talk about that a great deal more with the two Davids that are here today. But from a governance point of view, and certainly as somebody who looks and helps boards develop their governance structures, one of the things that we commonly see lacking are risk appetite statements. And your risk appetite statements around your climate agenda and your ESG are going to be critical. So they need to be built into what you already have, providing, of course, you've got that there. And the fifth element for me is oversight. And in the oversight, I would include the review of the reporting and the MI that you receive, the information that you receive, and obviously there's a big part of the survey that was around data, so we'll be going back to this. But those 5 elements, right structure, right values, efficient and effective individuals, risk management, oversight, those 5 elements coming together for me are good governance, and as I say, that chimes very much with where the regulator is.
So really clear, Julia, thank you for that. So should fund board governance look any different when they come to actually assess, ESG and climate risk?
Actually, for me, no. There is no changes. Providing you've got that structure and you've assessed that structure and you're satisfied that you've done that, what you've got then is a framework to build this aspect of requirements into that governance framework. You shouldn't see it as an adjunct. For me, it's not separate. It should be part and parcel of how we're living and breathing it. It picks up on the cultural and the values aspect for me. So for me, no different.
Okay, I think we'll touch on the cultural difference in a bit. So what is holding fund boards back? In your view?
In my view, I think there is the cultural element. I think there's in some aspects there's a reluctance to admit that there is something that they need to do, and I think we're going to have to be a little bit braver around that, and around, this is where, to be honest with you, our INED should be challenging to actually ask some of those difficult questions about why is this, if this does appear to be problematic, why is it problematic? So we need that debate and that challenge in the first instance across our governing bodies. But I think there's definitely some legacy issues about the way in which we all participated in our governance structure historically, and that perhaps reluctance to accept that there is a personal responsibility and liability for those people who are stepping up to the plate as senior managers and leaders of our firms.
And do you think, Julius, on that point, do you think a lot of people actually realise that it's personal liability when it comes to?
I think it's certainly very evident to me when I'm.
That's in the UK, of course.
In the UK, absolutely. And I think that's only going to increase. So we really do need to have to knuckle down and ask ourselves those challenging questions. Do we know enough about this? It's all very well for me to turn around and say, is your MI right? But if we don't know the right questions to ask, or we're not sure about what it is that we're looking at, then it's going to be very difficult to answer that question. Is this the right MI? Is this the right data that I'm receiving from the investment community?
Okay, thank you. So, David H. Julia mentioned culture. So when you're actually selecting managers, how do you assess if their boards have a sustainable governance culture?
So there's no magic science to this. We have to get into the weeds in a typical manager researcher style, where we historically have focused on investment decision making, and secondarily operational decision making. The third leg now in most manager research processes is to look at sustainability in those organisations, right from the investment strategy and the implementation, how embedded is the set of processes in there, all the way through to the management of the business. And that, back to some of the points you're making and evidenced by the survey in terms of staffing, is all about budget, financial control, how much are we prepared to resource to address this issue. So there we run a questionnaire, we follow that up with meetings, we try and focus on alignment, application and accountability, and we try and meet as many people in the team as possible from all different parts of the organisation and cross-check the answers, make sure they self-corroborate, and really try and see that this philosophy is embedded throughout the organisation rather than just on the front marketing side when we're talking to the investor relations people, for example.
I'm going to touch on stewardship in a moment and engagement, but actually in respect of this, that's going to be more on the company side, but actually, do you think engagement with those asset managers that you maybe be selecting is important as well? Is that something that you do?
Yeah, look, I think asset owners have the primary responsibility ultimately to enforce their trustee policies on the service providers they use, whether it's the administrator, custodian or the asset manager. Yeah. And so, we're acting on their behalf, and, we certainly get asked by those asset owners how we're, the question you've asked, how are you going to do this? Yeah. Because it is part art, part science, but, back to a couple of points mentioned earlier, it's a new sector, it's a new industry, it's a new requirement, and we're very early into this journey. So you can but only lean on traditional skills and processes that are tried and trusted for operations and investment decision making. You have to apply that same methodology, I think, to get into the weeds of the organisation's culture. You know, you have to start with a definition. You know, we're looking for sustainability as a formal definition, that it is the, you know, repeated proper use of human, physical and natural resources without their long-term denigration. It's a bit of a mouthful. It doesn't jump off the tongue that easily, but you have to choose the words carefully to make sure you are seeking something that can be identified. And you know, quite often it's, as I say, scoring these organisations sounds a little bit overly scientific for what is a human resources issue fundamentally. And you know, we still see, as evidenced in the survey, that the key problem there is the volume of resources and skill sets and the depth of those, ourselves included, in what is obviously, as I say, a very early stage. And you know, there's not many people around in the industry, certainly not enough people around in the industry per fund, that have 10 years experience in this area.
Yeah, well, that leads me nicely on to the climatologists sitting on the panel today. So, David, I'm going to ask you a question around stewardship and engagement, an area I know you're really, really passionate about. So do you think that fund boards should be reviewing the kind of stewardship and voting policies of their asset managers and funds that they're responsible for, and assessing whether they're actually following those policies?
I think absolutely they should. I think it was a point that David made about the importance of, there's multiple stakeholders who all have a responsibility in here. And there's we as the asset manager, there's the fund boards, there's then the advisors to the fund boards. Everybody has duties of care and responsibility. And it means that there must be alignment. If interests aren't aligned, you're creating tensions and conflicts of interest all over the place. You'll impair the longer term sustainability objectives of the underlying client, and you will also impair the longer term performance achievements of the asset manager, because you're creating this tension and conflict. And I can't for the life of me think of a reason why a fund would allocate capital to an asset manager whose values and culture, to borrow Julia's term, is fundamentally different from the asset owner. I mean, it's creating all manner of problems.
And how important do you think engagement is?
So I think engagement is an extremely powerful tool, which currently I don't think is being utilised by the asset management industry as effectively as it might. There's far too wide an acceptance of the status quo, and nobody really wants to rock the boat. I'm going to borrow Julia's word again, in the word bravery. People don't want to stand out and be different. They want to quietly carry on with the day job. And for some of these issues, we're taken to its extreme. Engagement isn't engagement, it's defenestration. We have the power as the owners of businesses to remove management teams and boards who aren't delivering what we want them to deliver. And ultimately, this is sort of a governance problem of a PLC. If the executive team aren't delivering on the priorities of the asset owners, get a new executive team. It's really easy, but very rarely done.
So engage rather than disinvest.
Disinvestment is sort of a last resort, I think, in that you disinvest because your governance problem is so great that you actually, as an asset owner, you don't have less influence. Well, that's not an investable asset. Or because it's not because engagement can't fix the problem. It's that the problem is so great that the investment returns aren't worth it. So you're engaging to fix, it's sort of almost altruistic. I'm sort of providing a service to the world by owning an underperforming asset to get it to go and do something different. Well, I've then betrayed my principal objective, which is I'm meant to be investing people's savings.
Yeah. Agree.
I've got a question. Can I just?
Of course you can.
Is there yet differentiation in degrees of engagement sufficient to make it a competitive positive for one fund manager versus another? In some strategies, so maybe the activist area springs to mind. That would be.
So clearly, yes, in that there are managers out there who are overtly activist,
Yeah.
but their activism seems to be more about short-term returns
investment
than
focused,
longer-term resolution
behaviour,
of issues.
Okay,
Thanks.
David H.
Thanks.
It's all right, a question
Okay.
for you.
Oh, okay.
So, how big a risk is the energy transition? So there's sort of two questions in this. And how important is it for boards and fund boards to actually focus on this, and how do they navigate through this energy transition?
So
About three questions in there, sorry,
that's
all in one
a
go.
bit of a cheat there to
Okay,
throw all
sorry.
three in together, but it's fine. Look, the energy transition is the easy one to answer, but it's not the easy one to address. It is absolutely critical, particularly if you think globally in developing markets, where it's not just about energy transition, it's actually about energy support of growing economies and taking millions, if not hundreds of millions or billions, up in terms of their wealth. So energy is fundamentally the chief driver of most nations' economic prowess, and getting the transition to non-fossil fuel energy sources is critical because they are the lion's share of carbon emissions from humanity's existence. So it's absolutely vital. The transition means different things between Western developed markets and economies where we are all about replacing existing economic activities, both in energy production and its consumption. But in emerging markets, it's just get it in. We need to help grow these economies. They're going to grow anyway. They're going to lean first to the easiest, most accessible fuel that they can get to help power their economy. And we need to help those economies exceed what we've done in the West almost, because they're wholly dependent on good energy, green energy for their growth going forward. Whereas we can, it's always tempting for the developed markets to sit and do nothing. We obviously have to respond to geopolitical events, and that might accelerate things, and that seems to be accelerating things in Europe in particular. More recently, with I think 11 governments passing new legislation to accelerate the various aspects of new energy. So it's front and centre, as you know, society-wide, and it's front and centre in governments and increasingly in the investment industry as well. We're pleased to say. How do boards respond to that? Which I think was the third question.
How do they respond and manage it?
Well, I think as your survey has said, data is one of the first thing you do, but that data has to lead to action in our view, and that has to lead to some portfolio realignment and selectivity of different types of investment opportunities, both in listed and unlisted markets. So they have to get the data first, but it's got to be with a purpose, rather than I need data because my industry bedfellows are all doing data gathering. I think I best not be the one that's out of line is not fantastically useful unless that inherently leads to further action in portfolios and approaches and investment strategy definitions. So that's at the heart of it. Whenever data is mentioned, people get a bit overexcited in the tech zone around it being the new oil, but it's not fungible. You can't swap my personal health data for some transportation data out there on the traffic light system. It's just not exchangeable. So the data has to be really tied very specifically to the investment strategy and the purpose for which it's being used. And then really, because we're at the early stages of getting data, we have to consistently repeat that exercise year in, year out. It's not so much is the data right? Is the number 4 here the right answer? Is that better than a 6 over there? That's not the point. The point is I was 4 last year. What am I this year? Am I 4 1/4, 4 1/2? Am I making progress down the right direction of travel? So I'd say getting the data in, having it drive some actions is far more important than just ticking the box, and that's the critical thing that we think needs to happen.
Okay, and we're going to touch a little bit more on data in a bit.
Course,
so Julia, when you talked about at the very beginning, what does good governance look like? And one of your 5 was, risk management, and we know climate risk is no different and should be treated just as another risk. But how do you think fund boards and asset managers should respond, to the emerging supervisory sort of expectations around climate risk?
I'm not sure that I see enough evidence actually that they are doing that. I mean, I would say with the risk frameworks, I would like to see more evidence of how that's being built into your existing risk frameworks, providing of course your risk frameworks were functioning properly in the first instance. It would always again go back to that that question around the MI, the data that people are seeing, and whether or not, as I've already said, if it's really telling them what they need to know. One of the interesting things that we would expect to see when we ask boards a very straightforward question that the regulator will commonly ask when they're doing when the UK regulator will ask when they're doing a supervisory visit, or even if they're interviewing individual senior managers, they will ask a firm what their top 5 risks are. Now, I would expect to hear more senior managers when we're doing those sort of mock questions with them, and we're trying to help them get ready. I would expect more of them to say something around sustainability, climate change, the issues that they've identified, and we're not hearing that.
I'll say, are you hearing that?
No, we're not hearing that. Okay. Which leads me to believe perhaps one of 2 things. One, it's either not being talked about in the way that we might expect, bearing in mind its importance, or again, it comes down to how much articulation has gone in at the governing body level, where they have been discussing risks in the way in which it's expected. So is that your framework? Is that your data? Is that your MI? It just starts to. It's a little bit like a scab. You start picking at it a little bit, and then all of a sudden you've got a bit of a gaping wound if you're not careful. If it's not being driven up the agenda, and it's not being articulated as at least in one of your top 5 risks, it's going to pose additional questions for the firm. And the first thing that certainly here in the UK, our regulator will be looking at is, what does that say about the governance? And again, going back on some of the things that we've all mentioned, what does that say about the culture, the importance that this has within your existing risk frameworks and your risk identification?
Yeah. And I think one thing that we're all going to agree on in a moment is there's probably an education and upskilling issue as well within the boards, and within our survey, actually 72% of our respondents, as Nick pointed out, actually said that they think there's a potential shortage of sort of climate specialists within the industry. So how confident are we, and I'm going to put this to all of you, I'm going to start with David at the end there, being the climatologist here, is how confident are we that we have the knowledge within the asset management world, actually throughout the businesses, not just at fund board level?
Bluntly, not remotely. I think the asset management industry sort of needs to grasp two fundamental truths. I mean, the one which is a point that David made earlier on about environmental degradation. That's now happening at a scope and scale that is demonstrably unsustainable. I mean, principally climate change, but not just climate change. And that's a phenomenon that's going to persist over the rest of my lifetime, and is going to get worse. And that's not sort of being hysterical about it. It's just that transition pathways being what they are, global CO2 levels are going up, temperatures are going up, and nobody's realistically talking about net zero this side of 2050. And even when you get to net zero, it's not that temperature stops going up then, you've still got another few years before it all settles out. And the second is the scope of the challenge in the energy transition to fix that problem. And that's, in tandem, those two phenomena are going to impact just about every investment in just about every asset class, just about everywhere. And this is not something that can be outsourced to the sustainability team. Yes, I've got an SRI team, they can go manage this. This is going to be integral to every decision every portfolio manager takes. It's going to be integral to how the risk management team think about not just short-term portfolio risks, but the long-term risks. Is this investment strategy able to deliver the long-term expectations of the underlying client base? It needs compliance to be competent to assess that these measures are being put in place, that it's being done effectively. We need to communicate it effectively. And how confident am I? I mean, is this widespread in the industry? I mean, I don't think even those basic first principles have really been accepted yet, let alone the tools and capabilities to do anything with it.
Yeah, I think the professional boards and the professional bodies have a strong role to play here in the training and education. I know the CFA, for example, have a certification in ESG, and it used to be, on my LinkedIn feed that, once a year I'd see that pop up on someone I know. I've got the ESG certificate from the CFA. But in the last 6-12 months, I can tell you, it's just been a lot more frequently taken. I believe you can take most of that online. So maybe, the pandemic, people sitting at home looking to reskill or improve their skills back up has led to some acceleration. But it's very well promoted and advertised, and certainly I think the next generation of fund managers, graduates coming through, ought to be looking at that sort of certification as part of their normal process. I'm not aware of any fund managers, even in the renewable space where we specialise, saying that you can't work here, you won't get the job if you don't have the certificate on ESG from the CFA. But certainly I think increasingly organisations ought to be looking for some kind of educational kite mark for individuals who have had that training or running courses themselves to get people up to speed across the whole gamut. It's a very wide and far-reaching and deep set of skills, techniques and information sets. Environmental is big enough on its own, let alone social and governance. It's a huge depth of individuals to cover.
It's interesting you say that, David, because about the requirements. Because at a firm level, firms might decide that that's their minimum standard. Correct, and they'll have that as a firm level. However, what they do have over them currently, and it came in as part of the senior managers regime, is there is a requirement that people are assessed as fit and proper. Yeah. Now, because that competence and capability part is in fit and proper, you decide what competent looks like, and that's part of the issue. We're not communicating effectively what we expect our people to be able to do. And in relation to this specifically, I think again we're going to have to be brave. We're going to have to be tough with ourselves and say no. Actually, if we're going to live by what we want to achieve and where we want to go and what we want to be saying to our ultimate investors, I think as an industry, we're going to have to say, no, there are minimum requirements, and if people aren't competent in this, then they can't work here.
But
And
in
asset management, we haven't done that. I mean, I've been in asset management for a long time. It's happened for our retail in the UK, for our retail wealth managers, but it hasn't happened for our institutional asset management. You still only need a qualification which is basically the same as an A level to manage billions of pounds worth of money in this country, and that's never sat well with me. And we've also got, let's not forget, because we haven't been doing that business review and been tough with ourselves, we've got an awful lot of people who are managing a lot of money who have no professional qualifications whatsoever.
And where do you think this should come from, Julia? Where do you think this should be driven from? At the senior management, at the fund board level, the regulator, the industry bodies, or all?
I would love to say funds themselves, the industry itself. Fund managers need to apply more scrutiny across what it means to be competent in their areas. That needs to come. Culturally, that needs to come. The tone from the top, from the board. But then, of course, the board might all get a bit fearful because if they do that 360 review. Oh gosh, where do we sit in the great scheme of this? But I would suggest as part of fund boards due diligence, they're asking more about and I think they've got to. I think you identified it, David. There's not enough knowledge. So the fund boards have got to think about their due diligence around this. What are the questions? What are the challenges that they're posing about? Okay, you say all of this, but show us that you've got the competence to be able to deliver on that promise. So I think in answer to the question, I would love it to come from the funds or from the asset management industry itself. From experience, I can see the industry turning around to the regulator and saying, tell us what to do. Because that's commonly what we do, and therefore you'll get it imposed, and yet again it will feel more painful if it gets imposed by the regulator. If we could do it ourselves, I think we could then really make it part of our culture and our values.
And what about and Julia, just to carry on with that conversation, what about other functions within the asset management business? The likes of the compliance teams and the audit teams. Do you think that they should have the knowledge to be able to assess and manage climate risk?
Absolutely, I agree with David that if we are looking to function effectively, we've got to have compliance, risk, and audit able to monitor that we are delivering as we say that we will, and that we're managing our risks in the way that we have set out within our frameworks. But I've been in firms where nobody's known what's even on their website about what it says about our response to the climate agenda, ESG and sustainability. And this is the staff. So that's an indicator for me that, actually that tone from the top hasn't drifted through. And certainly I would say that how I might describe it, the second line activities are probably even further away, because the focus always appears to be that this is all an issue around, around the investment policy. And actually, it's wider than that. But have we got enough people who are thinking about the wider picture? But if the staff don't know what you've got on the website, or the fact that as an organisation you've signed up to the investment principles, as released by the UN, or they've never seen them before, again, it's just going to ask those questions about what are we saying.
And David, do you think that people within the asset management community and the fund boards specifically really understand what climate risk means?
It's me another brief answer.
No, I was expecting it to be fair.
It's a close question. Do you?
So I could wax lyrical about this for the entire session. I think there's an unfortunate tendency to equate climate change with reasonably catastrophic long-term outcomes. So melting ice caps, sea level rise, and if I'm not underwater, then everything's tickety-boo. And I can understand the desire to use those dramatic scenarios for a communication point of view, but for our purposes, it's not wildly helpful. And I think there's sort of two major misunderstandings at the moment. The first one is that it's happening now. If we take sort of a reasonably live example, before last year, the hottest it had been around Seattle in the United States was 38 degrees. And that's a data set that runs back for 50 odd years or so. And in early summer last year, maybe earlier in the year than that, the temperature spiked to 47 degrees. And that is if we assume that there is no human impact on climate, that event you could expect to happen once every 150,000 years. So probably humans were involved. And heat stress is important because heat stress is the biggest killer in the United States of any kind of natural disaster. So this is a very serious issue, and it's happening right now. The second one is understanding that climate change, and so this talk about, it's easy to think it's only a degree. What difference does that make? It's sort of sitting here. What's the annual temperature range? Probably a cold winter's night, be -10. Hot summer's day, it'll easily be 30. So, okay, I've got 40-degree range. What does 1 degree matter? But if you think about the shape of that normal distribution bell curve, if I shift that over to the right by a degree, the area under the tail of the curve has just got much, much bigger. So I've got events that previously were unthinkable have become possible, and events that used to be once every 50 years have become a once in 20-year event. And it's that probability, for us as investors, that probability matters. Because if I take another live example, so a business who's a medical devices manufacturer relatively near to the coast, what used to be a 1 in 50-year flood risk for them is rapidly becoming a 1 in 20-year flood risk. And there's $1 billion of somebody else's drug passing through that factory. Well, no insurer is going to touch that. A 1 in 20 year, no thank you very much. And the underlying client is going to take one look at that and saying, hang on, you're telling me there's a 5% chance that my $1 billion drug isn't getting delivered? No thank you very much. And so what I've got is a very expensive factory on some quite expensive real estate that is worth functionally zero. And that's an issue that's happening right now. And the ability for management teams and companies to take action and do something about it is available now. There's a window of opportunity to do it right now. And nobody's really prioritising it or thinking about it. And the penalties for being slow and being late are pretty obvious. You try and sell that asset in 10 years' time, everyone's going to figure out it's a problem. It's going to be worth nothing. Well, that's not great business, is it? So, I think the third point I'd make is, you sort of referenced my having a bit of a background in climatology. I have done a bit of climatology, but climatology is really just the start. I'm seeing David mentioned sort of posts on LinkedIn and things. You see all sorts of job adverts for people, sort of investment companies hiring climatologists. What on earth do you need a climatologist for? You don't need a climatologist. Unless you're planning on running your own hundreds of millions of dollars of global climate model, what you need is to understand the implications of that changing climate. And for that, you need hydrologists and geomorphologists and ecologists, because what we're interested in is the environmental impact of the climate change. But even that's only the start of the question, because what we're really, really interested in are what are the socioeconomic consequences of that environmental change. And the question we're faced with is, okay, what do those socioeconomic consequences mean for the profit generation of the companies that you invest in? Well, that is so when I'm sort of gloomy about our industry's ability to answer these questions, it's because we've got to distill all of those uncertainties, all of that complexity, and get it down to what does it mean for the profits of this business? And that is a very serious challenge.
Thank you. So moving over to another challenge, or seen as a challenge, and it's data. And, only 30% or a third of our respondents in the survey said they felt they had sufficient data to analyse climate risks across the funds. So David H., I kind of know what answer you're going to give me. So do you think this should be a barrier?
No, no. There you go. There's the answer you expected. But it's there's I think last count I think we totted up something like 600 different companies providing ESG, sustainability kind of. To mention one there, evidently, to boards and investors. So, tech is a wonderful thing. It gets out there. It can, natural language process, AI. We can bring the data to the table in many shapes and forms. And of course, the tech industry, as I say, is a sort of 600, mostly startups, but some within bigger businesses as fund manager service providers already providing this data. The sufficiency is the interesting question, because the data and the technology providers are tuning what they can gather to the needs of the industry that has not yet fully specified its requirements. Mm-hmm. And so the two parties, the buyer and the provider of this data, are sort of doing this weird dance. Have I got a service for you? Oh, what is it all about? Well, look, you need data, and here is how I give it to you. Yeah, I think that's the right one. And 2 weeks later, there's another service provider knocking on the door with the same story, slightly different data. So I'm not that at this stage too bothered about whether one is right or better than the other. Mm-hmm. The key point is that you use something and you start somewhere. It's an early industry. I'd make the point again, but in data, it's critical that they get some data. And they see the progress with that service provider from year to year. And I think that's very evidently doable. Mm-hmm. And I don't, people saying I haven't got the sufficient data. Well, go find yourself one of the 600 service providers. You will have data, more data than you can poke a stick at. Mm-hmm. Now that is only the first part of your issue. What are you going to do with it? How does it fit into your investment process, into your governance structure? And then what actions does it lead to? All better questions than, can we find the data for me?
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So, Julia, I'm going to move swiftly because I see some nice questions coming through and the clock is ticking. So what do you think, or how do you think the expectations will develop in respect of how we report climate risks to the investors?
It's my fervent hope that actually, as the regulator develop, and I think we will get to a stage where they will be more prescriptive about the way in which this is done. I don't think I'm hopeful that they won't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think we have to hang on to the clear, fair, not misleading. I think we've really got to test ourselves, and again, we've got to be brave with the way that we review this. We've got to put ourselves in the shoes of the investors and make sure that it's readable and that it tells a convincing story. I would just throw in here, because thinking about this from coming at this from a regulatory point of view, they are going to take the side of the investor. Investors will start asking the very, very simple and basic questions that we've got to answer, which is, how do we as an industry square the fact that, we still, in terms of our profit, make against other industries, we still make an awful lot of money out of doing what we do in asset management, and how do we square that with if we carry on as we are at the moment, still being the driver to continued investment in fossil fuels. It's very simple, and that's what investors, they'll start to cage those very simple questions, which are far beyond obviously the nuances of how do we make those investment decisions. But I would root people back to going back to basics and think about how that looks, how their presentation of data looks when it is going to be in the hands of the investors at the end of the day.
I agree. So what I'm going to do is, because we've got lots of questions coming through, and I'm going to give one to each of you. I'm going to pick out one that I think
wholly unscripted. This is
completely, wholly unscripted. I've got them flying in. There's quite a lot, and then I'm going to just finish the panel with one question to all of you. So we've got 10 minutes approximately, or 9 minutes now. So first of all, David H, I'm going to pick on you for the first question. Sure. So do you agree having ESG labelled funds is unhelpful because the issues affect every security/fund?
In a word, yes. Okay. In 5 years' time, our view is that you won't be able to buy a fund that isn't ESG rated, structured, assessed. So I personally think that having it as a standout marker today smacks merely of marketing and labelling. If we can get the processes and the governance right across all our funds, then it should be less of a distinguishing feature on the front cover. Clearly, as a researcher, I will then be able to say this one is slightly better than that one, or there's more intensity about what they do there, and that one is a bit more website marketing orientated as an approach, whereas this one here is really in depth through the culture of the organisation and all the way through into the investment application strategy and implementation. So, I'm longing for the day when we don't need to have the roundtable to talk about is ESG a thing or not,
yes,
because it's embedded into the industry. But that's a 5-year journey at least, and maybe a bit longer, maybe a bit more.
So one for you, David, at the end there. So how can asset managers implement effective sustainability due diligence without adequate scientific capabilities, which take time to build? And is regulatory oversight of this process necessary in order to create a level playing field? 2 questions in one there. Sorry.
So I'm going to paraphrase Kurt Vonnegut, which is that any portfolio manager who can't explain what they're doing to an 8-year-old is a charlatan. And it's true. I mean, if we cannot explain some of the questions posed by Julia, if we can't explain what we're doing, why we're doing it, how we're measuring it, then we're charlatans. And I think that there's to do some of the work, you do need to have technical expertise. To understand the output of the work, you don't.
Correct.
You just need to be able to ask an intelligent question, the one posed, and expect a comprehensible answer. And if you don't get a comprehensible answer, the chances are the person answering the question doesn't know. So I would be, there needs to be a broadening of education around the issues. There needs to be a confidence built that what are the questions that we can ask that are going to lead us down the path of identifying whether these issues are being addressed or not. But I don't think fund boards need to think that they have to be able to do it all themselves. No. They have to be able to interrogate us to ensure that we're doing it.
Ask the right questions.
And I'll just chip in on this idea of level playing field. It's a bit like postcode lottery. These are the 3-word punchlines that we throw at many problems. And I'm not convinced there needs to be a level playing field. I think I'd like to, I'm not keen on extra regulation or legislation, but if it is perhaps inevitable, if we don't get our collective act together in this arena, then I'd beg that it is risk and principles based rather than rules and formula based. And then the level playing field for me means that you get something appropriate for each organisation and see that in that context, rather than saying, like, here's the bar that we artificially set, you all need to rise above that together, and then that burdens the smaller organisation disproportionately to the larger organisation. Again, I don't think that's necessarily what we really want as an outcome.
Great.
So one final question to yourself, Julia. So this is how the panel, but I'm asking you, how does Julia see the role of the depository evolving to oversee fund boards in respect of ESG?
I think again it's about the same principles. Their principles of governance need to be exactly the same. It doesn't change. I don't care whether or not you're an asset manager, a depository, a trustee. Those principles remain the same. Those governance principles, and I think it's around the required due diligence that you need to do, and picking up, as David's just alluded, it's that challenge. Keep asking the investor questions. Think about your responsibilities, who you're responsible to. Put yourself in their shoes, and you're there to ask those questions on their behalf. Ask them.
Completely agree. Having a depository myself. So just one last question to the panel. And we've got 3 minutes, so you've got a minute each, no longer. So David, if the industry has one thing to do this year relating to climate risk, what would you want it to be in 1 minute?
Oh, crumbs. To embrace the idea that physical risks of climate change is more immediate and needs addressing. It's not something to panic about, but now is the time to start taking action to do something about it.
Thank you. Julia?
For me, it would be budget. You've got to be talking about this, and you've got to agree that there is going to be a cost. And as I've already alluded to, we know that proportionally the percentages that we make in terms of profit across asset management, across all aspects of asset management, are still much more than other industries. We've got the money. Mm-hmm. We've got to put the budget aside and decide how much this is a cost, and it will be a cost that budget has to be set aside, and we need to be ready to spend it.
David H.
I'd echo what Julia is saying. Boards have to lean in, get on with it. I don't care what the data set is, just be getting on with some data set so that you can see progress next year. And before you do that, make sure you're doing it with purpose. What is the purpose? What is the actionable outcome that you're looking for if the line moves north, south, or sideways? Without that action outcome, it's just another piece of cost-based reporting that we're all having to subscribe to because someone else tells us to. We really want boards and investors to act, and have an actionable outcome.
Great. So I think our time is up. Lots of questions. I'm not sure if we can find a way to answer some of those questions online, Nick, because we've got lots of others. So sorry to those that I didn't manage to cover all of those questions. But thank you to the panel. I think that was a really interesting and insightful discussion. I hope everyone else enjoyed the webinar today. And have a great day. Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.